Hello, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Welcome back. I am recording this on World Autism Awareness Day, April 2nd, and this is also Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month. So I wanted to revisit my conversation with Dr. Barry Prizant about turning kids' passions and enthusiasms into superpowers. This episode remains one of our most impactful discussions, and I am really excited to share it with you again today. But before we dive into today's episode, I want to let you know about an exciting change coming to the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. Beginning in May, we'll be shifting our weekly schedule to a twice monthly format, with new episodes airing on the first and third Tuesday of each month. What this change does is it allows us to focus on creating even higher quality episodes for you, while freeing up time for us to connect with our community, you, our listeners, in new ways. We're planning interactive webinars where you can ask questions and get them answered in real time. That is something that a lot of our listeners have been asking for. We just did a webinar on ADHD, different treatments with Sarah Langley, which was well received. And we want to provide more of those opportunities along with other engaging events. We've always been committed to providing you with valuable content that supports diverse thinkers, and this adjustment will help us deliver an even better listening experience and also expand our offerings to our community. Thank you so much for your continued support, and we look forward to this next phase of our journey together. Now, let's get to today's episode with Dr. Barry Prizant on turning kids' passions and enthusiasms into superpowers. What would happen if we switched from seeing problematic behaviors as a child being defiant and willfully uncooperative to seeing those behaviors as strategies to cope with anxiety and emotional dysregulation? Well, my guest today is going to talk about what happens when we make that shift. He will also show us how reframing deep interests as enthusiasms and passions, you can help kids expand their learning and connections and become more confident and motivated to engage. My guest today is Dr. Barry Prizant. He's a speech-language pathologist with close to 50 years experience as a researcher and international consultant for autistic individuals and their families. He's a visiting scholar at Brown University and director of the Childhood Communication Services. Dr. Prizant has written numerous books, scholarly chapters, and articles, presented more than 900 seminars and keynote addresses internationally, and he gave 2 invited presentations at the UN for World Autism Awareness Day. And he is here with us today to talk about turning kids' passions and enthusiasms into superpowers and his incredible book, Uniquely Human.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Dr. Prizant, welcome to the podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here, Karen.
It is so great. I read your book a while back. I had to reread parts of it again before this conversation, and it is even better the second time reading it. So for those listeners who may not know, you wrote a book, Uniquely Human. It is absolutely exceptional, and you bring decades of experience working with individuals with autism and their families, and you really help parents and educators embrace the uniqueness of individuals on the spectrum, and you present the information, what I think is really from a place of compassion, empathy, and a recognition of strengths and gifts that many of these kids bring to the world.
Yes. That's our goal. And there's so much going on now, both with the self-advocate movement, as well as with what parents are saying, which is very much complementary to what our goals are as well. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I really feel like your book, this book, and others like it for other areas of neurodiversity should be essential reading for clinicians who get training in DSM, but they need this as well because it humanizes individuals with different neurodevelopmental disorders.
Yes, and I think not only humanizes, but challenges a lot of the myths that unfortunately are still out, especially in the general public, about what the autistic experience is. There's no doubt. And if I just might add, and this is just brand new news, the expanded and updated edition of Uniquely Human just came out a few days ago.
Oh, wonderful. All right. And is it available already?
It is available. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to get a link from you so that I can make sure that I add this to the show notes so that people can get that expanded version.
Yes.
You know, the stories in your book, you know, resonate with families. They resonate with educators, clinicians. And I think an aha moment for everyone comes from seeking to understand a behavior rather than jumping in to fix it. Can you talk about that? Because I think that is so common still in many instances.
Sure. And I think there are a couple of very strong influences that kind of led me on that path. And actually, that path started back in the 1970s. Well, actually, back in the late 60s when I worked at summer camps. But in the 70s, I did my master's thesis and doctoral dissertation on autism. Some people think, oh, the dark ages, nobody knew anything. There was information out there. And I actually worked in a very, very nice family-centered program. But I'm a developmentalist by training. My training is in, of course, being a speech pathologist. It's in language and communication, but social, emotional, cognitive development. And not that, or unfortunately, too many people have not been trained who are practitioners in an in-depth manner in child and human development. So in terms of the different perspective and the different lens that I look through, it's very much a developmental lens based upon, 50 to 100 years of research on child development, which allowed me and still allows me to look at children not through the lens of deficit and pathology, but allows me to look at children and every person as an evolving human being. And where are they? And also as an evolving human being who's trying really hard to cope, who's trying really hard to communicate. And so that perspective allowed me to go on a slightly different path than many people in the field of autism.
Right. And I think that's just so important. I think when parents and educators, particularly, because you go through a number of examples in your book, if you can shift from, responding to a behavior and instead watch, listen, pay attention, and you say, ask why they are doing the behavior, then you can really meet them where they are and provide the level of the support that they need rather than the support that you think that they should get.
Yeah. I mean, for decades and decades, parents and professionals have always said, if I could only understand my child or even my adult family member on the spectrum and see the world the way they see it. And if you're not on the spectrum, with all due respect to people who are, if you're neurotypical, your brain is different and you can't see the world the same way. But we've always felt it's so hard. I mean, it's so important and it's so hard to really work at trying to understand, for example, if a child is having a meltdown, just before going into the cafeteria and he falls to the floor in the school, what's he or she feeling at that time? What is their experience? It's very easy to dismiss it as non-compliant behavior or uncooperative behavior or avoidant behavior. But that doesn't explain, in some cases, the terror that child is feeling, or at least the anxiety that the child is feeling. And one quick thing that I'll add to that, I found, and I work closely with parents and have for decades, that parents appreciate when professionals try to respectfully understand what the child and family is going through.
Mm-hmm. And, what you said was so important because, what educators sometimes see, and you've described, and I've seen it as a clinician who gets these teacher rating forms and speaks with teachers, is that they see those behaviors as willfully uncooperative or a child who's defiant. And what you talk about is that we have to really see these behaviors as a child's way of coping with their own dysregulation. And when you do that, then you can respond accordingly, which is what you're describing when you talk about these meltdowns.
Yes, exactly. And I think almost more than any other area that I've worked in terms of, children and people with labeled disabilities, I think working with children and people on the spectrum really requires professionals to truly be reflective. So if a child challenges you and we say, oh, well, he's just oppositional, or he's just being non-compliant, or she's being manipulative, I think we have to kind of reflect on our own belief system and say, oh, well, why do I feel that way? Okay, I mean, I love it when children cooperate with me, and kind of gets me a little bit, it's off-putting to me when this child runs the other way. When I say, oh, let's sit down and do some work at the table or whatever. But sometimes it's more about the therapist or the clinician or the teacher in terms of their own desire to be successful. And if they're not successful, they could say, oh, it's the child's fault. And I'm not saying they don't love and want to do the best for the kids, but I find that, and maybe this is an unfair generalization, that professionals with many years of experience learn to shift and say, well, why does the child feel this way? Or why is the child acting this way? And too often, young professionals or professionals trained in a certain way will just say, okay, well, that's manipulative behavior. Okay. Well, that's attention seeking behavior. Well, that's non-compliant behavior. And when you do that, it gives yourself permission not to ask the why question. You don't have to go any further. Okay, I'm going to look at non-compliant behavior. There are 5 instances of non-compliant behavior during the morning circle this morning. And you don't go to, but why? Was the child confused with the language? Was there a change in routine? Did the child not sleep well the night before? Those are the kinds of questions we need to ask.
Absolutely. And that's when we shift from being that observer and just noting those behaviors, like you're saying, and really being helpful. And also when you respond and you attend to what a child is experiencing, then you can actually help them with that emotional regulation piece and bring down their anxiety. Because if there's anxiety behind the behavior and you just look at the behavior and try and reduce the behavior by shaping it or by rewards, then you're not addressing the underlying issue behind it.
That's absolutely correct. And you're not getting to the true solution. What you're doing is, kind of stop the behavior. But one of the things we discuss in Uniquely Human in depth is that in many cases, what might seem to be difficult behavior are attempts for the child to regulate emotionally. So this may sound a little strange, but if a child is seated in the classroom, let's say, fourth grade class, and let's say it's a little girl on the spectrum in fourth grade, and she can't sit still, and then she gets up out of her chair, and the teacher says, you need to sit down, and she gets up, sits down, gets out of her chair again, and then she bolts out of the classroom. You could say, oh my God, that first of all, there could be concern because it could be unsafe behavior. But maybe it's that little girl just couldn't tolerate sitting, listening to a teacher talk for a half hour. And we need to change, not the supports, maybe offer breaks, but teach in a way that's a better match for the way her brain processes information.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is true. I know the focus of the book is kids are on the spectrum, but I see that in kids with ADHD as well, where the behavior is seen as defiance. But then if you don't understand, because emotional regulation is an important piece of ADHD as well, that, being able to understand, and then you can figure out a way to help kids regulate. And then that decreases the anxiety, and then they can connect with their teacher, with their peers, with the learning experience in a way that you want, right? And that's essentially what you want, is them to engage and for them to to decrease that anxiety and to feel confidence in their interactions.
Absolutely. And you made a very important point there, that the ability to connect, and let's talk about connection on an interpersonal level, to engage and stay engaged with another person, or connect with information being presented, kind of like on a learning cognitive level, that can't happen if a child is putting so much energy into staying well regulated or coping, or just sitting there in a puddle of anxiety. And you're absolutely right with the ADHD analogy, and we do know that there's a fairly high co-occurrence of ADHD and autism. But, for us, it's really about children who have problems communicating and staying well regulated emotionally. And that cuts across so many disability categories. It's not just an autism thing.
Absolutely. And, in addition to being attuned to what children are experiencing, it's really clear to also, and this is helpful for parents because so much of the focus is often on what they kids can't do and where the trouble lies. But it's really essential to build on the strengths of individuals on the spectrum to foster that communication that is a struggle for many and support their emotional regulation. Can you talk about the importance of honoring a child's interests and their strengths?
Yeah. And also understanding that a deficit checklist approach doesn't help. I mean, I coined that term in a 1983 article, looking at language, and especially echolalia. But, and I think echolalia is a good example of what we're talking about here. And echolalia is the tendency to repeat speech. It could be repeated immediately or delayed. Through the lens of pathology, it looks like, oh, that's problematic. It's been called meaningless parroting, psychotic speech. But through another lens, it may be looked at as an alternative strategy for acquiring language, for expressing different purposes or functions of communication. And so you could look at, in some kids, I'm not saying all kids are all people, but in some kids, echolalia is their alternative strategy to move into language, and it's a relative strength. But strengths go well beyond that. Many, many kids on the spectrum, and adults, have peaks and valleys. That's almost definitive of autism spectrum disorder. And the peaks could be characterized by intense interests. I call them enthusiasms, and I swiped that term from a wonderful mother who passed away about 10 years ago, Clara Claiborne Park, who wrote about her daughter's enthusiasms, who became a really established artist and still is. But the point is that if we have problems in helping people on the spectrum to share attention with us, to do activities with us, doesn't it make sense to try to look at what really rivets their attention? What do they seek out? What do they want to do? Whether it's numbers, letters, whether it's drawing cartoon characters, whether it's talking about World War II airplanes, on so many different levels, from preschool all the way up to adults with very sophisticated enthusiasms. It just opens the door to building relationships, building self-esteem, having more to talk about. Some people say, well, she's not conversational. She only talks about what she's interested in. All right, you want to have a good conversation? Some of it should at least be about what she's interested in. And we see dramatic differences in so many ways when we go with a child or a student's interests and enthusiasms. And I think one of the most important things is building trust. That we all have more of a trusting relationship with somebody who's interested in what we are interested in. And it's tougher to build that if we're speaking to somebody and they show no interest in what your passions are, what your hobbies are, what your interests are.
Right. And it's really about, instead of forcing someone else to join your experience, you're joining them. And by doing that, you're honoring them and showing that you value what it is that they have to contribute to the conversation, to the world.
Absolutely. And I think, an important point there, because this question comes up frequently, is, well, do we always have to go over to the interest of the child? Doesn't it get stuck? Isn't it limited? Don't you hit a ceiling where you just can't go, any further than talking about Disney characters? And what I like to say is, and what I see very talented parents, therapists, and educators do, is they have that as a foundation and then expand. So I love to show during presentations, I show a video of a young boy from the UK, and his passion is flags of the world. And he's kind of memorized the flags that go with different countries. But then on the video, his mother is interviewed, and she says, it didn't stop there. that he learned about the culture of the country. He learned about the languages that were spoken in the country. He learned about, the incredible geography and the sites of the different countries. And the expansion happened because people took an interest in that. So let me give you another example that's a little bit lower level than that.
Yes.
Okay. Um, uh, a child who loves calendars. And so dad bought him desktop calendars. He loved to scribble on them. And I think he liked the symmetry and all the boxes and everything else. And what his dad discovered in the scribbling, and this was a 5-year-old, in the scribbling, what the dad discovered was it wasn't just scribbles, that he had memorized all the birthdays of kids in his class. And when you look closely, and he could tell you, he speaks like in 1 to 3 word sentences, he could tell you, oh, that's Jessica's birthday, and that's Amanda's birthday, because that's what the teacher did at school. She had a calendar and she put in all the birthdays. But let me take it to the next step.
Right.
Then the dad and the mom decided, well, what else could we do with calendars? And I was kind of consulting to them a little bit from a distance. And I said, well, calendars, there are calendars about birds. There are calendars about flowers. There are calendars about countries. Many of them you get for free from philanthropic organizations. And so it ended up, they collected some of those, but they never thought of those as a learning opportunity. So they had the foundation and the interest of their child because it was based in a calendar, but then they could talk about different kinds of flowers and different kinds of animals. And he became very interested and would begin to ask, a calendar about food, So I think the point is that a lot of it, the ability to expand on those interests, which might lead to talents in some cases, but not all cases, it depends on our creativity. It's not just, and the term that's often used, well, he's obsessed with calendars. And that's why we prefer the term, he's enthusiastic about calendars. And the autism community talks about terms such as deep interests, as opposed to obsessions is sometimes looking through the lens of pathology. If you're obsessive about something, you have to reduce it or you have to get rid of it. Okay. If you're enthusiastic about something, it creates all kinds of opportunities for you.
Right. Because you're moving from trying to reduce the interests to really expanding the interests and engaging them in a broader way.
Absolutely. And again, think of the child's experience. If the child says, wants to do something on his calendar, and we go, no more calendars. Stop it with the calendars, Stop asking about the whatever, the Beanie Babies. That's a little bit in the past, but
right.
And what we're doing is we're dismissing what the child is interested in. Okay. Again, I always like to think about our experience. If you go to a social event, and for me in particular, I love to fish, and I start speaking to somebody about fishing. Oh, I love saltwater fishing. I like freshwater fishing. I don't do it as much as I'd like to, but I live on the coast, so I like that. And if somebody says, no more talking about fishing, how are you going to feel about that person? Now, respectfully, the person might say, well, I don't fish, but I might be interested, or what kind of fish? Do you like to eat the fish? It gets into a respectful exchange of sharing information.
Right. And I think that respect is so important because you're respecting the child's interests. And when you do that, again, you're meeting them where they are, you're valuing their experience. And then also it's an opportunity to expand, not only in terms of learning, but expand in terms of engaging with another person about their interests. And together you can expand and you can learn a lot at the same time.
Yes, and then it's funny because on that little video I mentioned of the boy who loves the flags, the mom actually says, "I'm learning about countries I never even knew existed."
Right.
And it actually goes beyond that. It's kind of humorous. The mom says, "Well, it was posted on the town's Facebook page, and people were saying." Oh my goodness, they would want to know what the flag of the day was because every morning he would take a different flag and put it up on a flagpole. And the mom said, everybody thought it was about the World Cup, but it has nothing to do with the World Cup. but she talks about how much she has learned. And I hear that all the time from parents. A number of years ago, I met a young man. I think I spoke about this in my book, Uniquely Human, who loved different types of barbecue. And and was 9 years old. And he became an expert on regional varieties of barbecue, okay? From barbecue in North Carolina to Texas barbecue. And he knew about 9 different kind of regional varieties of barbecue and the different spices in each one. And I remember the mom saying to me, she came up to me after I was giving a talk, I think it was in Maryland, and the mom asked and said, "Oh, so we've been exposing him to cooking shows on TV, and he loves it. I think he's going to be a chef." It's fascinating when you see that.
It really is. And I think I love your whole idea of turning these passions and these interests in barbecue or, flags or calendars and these enthusiasms into superpowers is what you describe. Can you talk about how can parents, educators, community members help foster that and to help make that transition from passions, interests, deep interests and enthusiasms into a child's superpower that they can own, feel confident in, and share with others and grow?
Yeah, I would say, at the very basic level, we should show appreciation. We should say to our kids, "Oh my goodness, you do such a nice job drawing those Disney characters," and then show that interest, but not just in words. If you have the time and the place, engage your child in that. That's just so important. Again, I could give tons of examples. A young man who I had diagnosed at 3, who's now in his late 20s. He drew cartoon characters before he could speak. And now he's an artist. He's at showings in galleries in New York City. But his parents nurtured that and they respected that and they expanded upon that. And if you meet this young man, his name is Justin, he would say, "Hi, I am Justin. I am an artist," and, just get him going about the history of Disney characters. He could tell you the differences between what Mickey Mouse looked like in the 20s versus the 30s versus the 40s, because the artists for Disney evolved a lot of their characters. They weren't just the same. But one question I should mention that comes up a lot is, but you just can't be doing that all the time. Does it ever get in the way? And sometimes if a youngster or a person is riveted on it and won't shift to other activities and just wants to do that, in a sense, it can get in the way if there are other things on the agenda. And what I always recommend at that point is, what I call there's a time and a place strategy. That, okay, well, we need to do this and maybe use visuals, maybe write it down, and then we can do that. So having designated times where it really is a special, focused, and shared time. But I also like to say, look at different ways that ability or that interest can be integrated in regular routines. Look for ways that child or person can connect with others with similar interests. It's a little bit easier, I think, once you get into middle school and high school, because there are clubs. There are Lego clubs. There are science clubs. Actually, Lego clubs for younger kids. So there are special interest clubs that, where you're no longer viewed as obsessive talking about that all the time. You're viewed as a genius because you know so much and you're good at it. So definitely those kinds of connections and looking to bring the community together. Even in what people refer to as kind of social skills groups. If you want kids, let's say 5th or 6th grade kids, to be conversational, have themes that they're interested in, such as superheroes. And talk about different films about superheroes. Bring in visual supports to talk about superheroes. I mean, you'll get conversations, so much more in depth and truly coming from those students than you would about, oh, let's talk about the weather today, or let's talk about, unless the students are fascinated by weather. And I've consulted to students who were absolutely fascinated by the weather. And I remember one student, there was a class doing a little bit of a kind of performance replication of the local news show. And this one student who was absolutely fascinated about weather, and he read about tornadoes and he read about floods. He was the weatherman for that show
Oh.
in an inclusive environment. And he
Right.
did a great job.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to the point that the limitations are in our creativity, in how we can see the possibilities for that. And, it may not be an eventual employment perspective, but it might be a hobby. And people go through phases. I've known kids who are absolutely fascinated with things in elementary school, and it disappears or it shifts to a different phase of interests. Whereas others, I tell a story of a young man who was fascinated with vacuum cleaners, but not just any vacuum cleaners, Auric vacuum cleaners. It had to say Auric on it. And he loved looking at pictures of Auric vacuum cleaners when he was 4, 5, 6 years of age. In his 20s, he worked at a garden center and made enough money, and the first thing he bought was an Auric vacuum cleaner. So sometimes those passions are lifelong, or at least decades long.
And so it really is about, if you think about parents and educators and community members, neighbors, it's about nurturing those talents, those interests early on, providing opportunities for kids to connect with others who share the same interests, particularly as they get older. And how do we foster, happiness? It's not only about learning, which is hard for parents who are seeing their kids struggle in a learning environment, to know that we have to think beyond learning and you have to engage before you learn, but really to foster happiness. And that's really, when you think about quality of life for all of us.
And a big piece of that, and yes, despite the old stereotypes of autism, a big piece of that is relationships with others, and others want to connect with you. And I always think about interests and enthusiasms, and especially kids who show more exceptional abilities. And that's estimated to be about 15 to 20% of people on the spectrum have true savant skills, like unusually accomplished abilities and skills, that it often levels the playing field. So, one story I'd like to share is a young man with real sensory issues. And he sometimes would start screaming in his inclusive classroom if there were unexpected sounds or sounds he didn't like. But he was also hyperlexic, and hyperlexia is a precocious self-taught reading ability. So he could read, some of it with limited comprehension, but that develops over time. But he could read and especially decode better than any of his third grade classmates. So I was visiting that class consulting, and I remember he let go of the screen. And I knew that he was a good reader. I knew this young man. And a little girl came over to me and said, well, Christopher screams when there are noises he doesn't like, but he's the best reader in the class. And it was almost as if she wanted to let me know, yes, Christopher has his challenges, but I want you to that we value him because of some of his abilities as well. And she really wanted me to know that, because she was Christopher's friend.
That is wonderful. She became an advocate. And that's kind of what we all have to do, right? Is to advocate for the differences in our peers.
Absolutely. And it does give you a different perspective on a person if you could see something they're good at, especially something that, we respect and that we value. And the reason this little girl, Lisa, knew that he was a good reader is that the teacher, very often, not every day, but when there would be a reading time, the teacher would ask, or even during a little lesson, on the smart board or whatever, the teacher would say, oh, Christopher, could you read the next 3 sentences? And he would be right up there reading it all, and the kids would go, wow. So that's another thing. When you asked earlier about how parents can nurture that, I think it's important for professionals working with groups of kids to give the opportunities for a youngster to shine with his or her abilities.
In your book, you describe a desire to transform desperation into hope, to replace anxiety with knowledge, to turn self-doubt into confidence and comfort, and to help parents see as possible what they thought was impossible. And you've absolutely done that with this book, Uniquely Human. And I can't thank you enough for being here today. We could probably continue the conversation for another hour, but I just thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for the contribution, the gift of this book. And I'm going to make sure that I put a link to it in the show notes and a link to the website, because you have a website, Uniquely Human.
Yes. And we have a website that has now 50 podcasts that I've done.
Goodness.
With my co-host who's on the spectrum. He's an audio engineer. Talk about special interests. He got a degree in music engineering. He has perfect pitch, incredible auditory acuity, and he does the engineering for our podcast, but he has a great sense of humor. One other shameless plug I would make, for the expanded edition of Uniquely Human, unlike the first edition, I was able to narrate the audiobook. And so it's stories. The book is about basically what I've learned from children and families, and it's lots of stories. But now I tell the stories of children I knew and still know, and families I knew and still know. So it's coming from my voice. The first audio book was not that well done, so somebody else did it.
Well, I will definitely pick up the audio book. I've got my book here with all my tabs. You can see it's like I stopped. I was like, okay, every page has got a tab. So it's just like the whole book. So, but thank you again, Dr. Prizant, for being here today.
Karen, thank you for the invitation. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, I would love for you to leave us a review. It helps other people find our podcast and find childnexus.com. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.